Hello, everybody. This is Philosophy 60, lecture number 7 for our YouTube channel. Tonight, we will engage the introduction to René Descartes' famous discourse on the method for rightly conducting one's reasons in the search for the truth in the sciences. A very long title. It's a piece that he spent writing for maybe 11 years, a very long series of meditations that is divided into 6 parts. And these 6 parts, Descartes reminds us, should be read part by part, each part in one setting for us to digest and meditate upon, reflect upon, and move to the next part. We're going to engage the first 4 parts in this class, beginning with part 1, of course, which begins by stating that good sense or reason, he uses the terms interchangeably, good sense, bon sens in the modern French, and in his time, the good sense was actually raison, reason, and that it's the most equally distributed and endowed faculty of all for all people. So he begins by writing not only in the vernacular French, but also talking about the equality of reason for all people. Again, he destroys the prejudice that reason, again, or the ability to use one's reason is a purview or the privilege of a group of scholastics, monks, or professional philosophers during that period. So we are invited into the text this way in part 1. After going through this and talking about himself not being so presumptuous to think he has more reason or being arrogant, that he does not jump to conclusions, and he advises that we take it slow. And I want to emphasize that taking it slow, reading slowly, ruminating, reflecting on what one reads is really a practice that Descartes inaugurates during the 17th century along the great Michel de Montaigne, the great essayist of this period. This is a very crucial thing to learn, that we live in such a fast-paced, speed-oriented culture that we do not slow down enough to take time to read, to think, and to actually orient our thinking through writing and reading in this way. We do not practice this, and this is something that we can learn from Descartes in terms of the examples that he gives. So he begins by reviewing his education. This is a crucial pattern in his first part. He went to La Flèche, a great Jesuit school, actually founded by Saint Ignatius of Loyola, and was one of the better, if not the best school in Europe during that time in La Flèche. And a very rigorous program in which he was admitted and thought himself to be among the most learned men of his times, and also learned students of his time, some of whom were being primed to become professors later, which he admires and respects, as he states in the discourse. The discourse then proceeds, though, however, to talk about his curriculum. And this is, I think, the starting point for any critical reading of Descartes, that the curriculum itself is really where the struggle begins. He learned the ancients, ancient history, and the reading of the ancients, the languages, of course, ancient Greek and ancient Latin, as was part of the practice of that day. And he also read poetry and discovered and practiced the great elements of rhetorical employment, or what we commonly call oratory today. And within this tradition, he speaks about its value as he goes forward, and he talks about how poetry can enlighten the imagination, fancy the imagination, let us give free rein to our thoughts, etc. How rhetoric allows us to speak well, convince, persuade, etc. The conversation with the ancients may help us learn from the great masters of the past. And then he speaks to both mathematics, philosophy, and theology. Mathematics is a great admiration for because of its austerity and its ability to come to the truth objectively. And this is important for later on in the discourse. Theology he reveres, but however, he kind of displaces it by saying he's alarmed to learn that anybody can get to heaven, whether they're learned or not, and therefore didn't see himself among the fortunate or the unfortunate. It wasn't worth the study to take that risk, which is kind of funny in Descartes' sense, since he does, spend much time on the proof for the existence of God. Philosophy, too many views about the world, and you'll never get a common understanding or a common agreement out of them. So he saw that as ultimately something that didn't have value either. Anyway, the entire educational program that he went through, the curriculum, he did not find himself satisfied in terms of going into the world. So this critique, and this is something that we should do ourselves in terms of what we're learning, what is of value to us from the curriculum and what isn't. And then to really understand that this figure, Rene Descartes, is someone who throws out both the baby with the bathwater and basically revolutionizes thinking. He wants to shift completely away from the traditional curriculum into something very different that is grounded in the search for certainty. And this is what the method does. Okay. There are two components here, and he ends up the first part by talking about traveling, etc. He ends up in Germany at the end, traveling and moving around, not staying put. Then ultimately ends up in Germany, and as we know, he's in a stove filled room, and stove heated room, and this is where he begins to discover, the reflective capacity of the mind. This is very important in the second part as we go forward. At the same time, he understands that he has not learned much about the universal method from traveling either, even though it's expanded his horizons. And this cosmopolitanism has given him a greater ability to bring things back to what he's going to call the method, something that he's going to put himself up as an example, a method that he will use himself as an example. And at the same time, it will become a universal. So this is really his quest, if you will. This is his project. His project is to come up with a method that is foolproof and certain in its investigation. So the method itself is based on doubt. And I think I mentioned already in the class that there are two types of doubt. There's methodological doubt, which is a step-by-step doubt that we witness in the discourse of method beginning in part 2. And the other is what is called hyperbolic doubt. Hyperbolic meaning going to the extremes, pushing the limit so far that there's no more place to go to doubt, right? Any more doubt available. This is a method that is used to confront the skeptical tradition of this period. The skeptics, of course, being those who are throwing into question the existence of God and doubting that. And again, Descartes, in his quest for certainty and the new grounding of the sciences, is again not interested in probability, not interested in just doubting things out of existence, but doubting things to the point, again, where it becomes certain. So you have this tension throughout the discourse on the method between certainty and probability, which was very much in the air of the 17th century. There are many probability theories that are invented during this time, many new mathematical formulas too that are invented. Anyway, returning to book 2, we have the 4 sufficient rules of logic. And these are crucial. He presents these towards the middle of the part 2 of how he came to come up with a condensation of logic and its investigations into 4 sufficient rules. The first rule being that things should be, transparent or self-evident to us. Anything that we see, we must be able to see it in its self-evident truth, and we must be able to see it, and this is crucial, clearly and distinctly. It must be very clear in the mind, and we're able to make distinctions about it on other in any investigation to be able to make these clear and distinct distinctions, among phenomena. Secondly, to break down the problems that we face into as many parts as possible so that we can reconstruct those parts into a greater whole and solve the problem. This is another crucial element of the method. Thirdly, the method involves us in the investigation, if you will, of how do we address a step by step. And he says we must start with the simple and move to the more complex, but not in a natural order of preference, but in an order that is according to reason. How do we get to reason? Reason always being behind to come to some kind of conclusion in this step-by-step analysis, but again, beginning with the most simple phenomena that what appears to us in consciousness. And again, what Descartes is inventing here is consciousness. Slowly and surely, he is inventing modern consciousness, or what we call today modern subjectivity and consciousness. So after this, the fourth moment, of course, is when in any investigation to be as thorough as possible, enumerate everything so that nothing is left out. So very foolproof in terms of you would go over each step and work with this. So this becomes a kind of basis for, and the example he gives is his own discovery of analytical geometry, which we'll, certainly tackle a little bit in the class upcoming this week, the week of November 29th through December the 6th or 7th. So anyway, we'll go through this and show this method at work, how he does that in terms of the theorem moving into the certainty of this discovery of what he calls analytical geometry. So anyway, keep these four sufficient rules in mind as we go forward. This is part two, a very, very crucial part of any kind of investigation, and this should help anybody with study rules, if you want, rules of study. I like this as rules of study, to be as clear and distinct about the lesson that one's reading or engaging, the theory one is engaging. Secondly, to be able to break it down into parts, to reconstruct it, to whole. Of course, making it move from a simple idea to more complex set of ideas, but all according to reason and not only to natural linear progression, or what we commonly do as linear progression, something very different, according to the rules of reason. And then fourthly, again, the enumerations that are so complete that we leave nothing out, leave absolutely nothing out. So in a way, Descartes is trying to put down the kind of almost perfect crime, if you will, in the history of philosophy, leaving nothing out, from the hypothetical to the actual, right? And covering all consequences, etc. This is an almost perfect inductive deductive system. And this is the method of the four sufficient rules of logic that he has reduced from the history of logic into just four sufficient rules. So we will go through that in the class, and he rules out the notion of the syllogistic reasoning and other kind of logical reasoning that no longer is applicable for our time. So there is an argument that goes on with Aristotle's positions on syllogistic reasoning in part two. All right, part three is interesting in the sense that Descartes needs to destroy the old house, if you will, and there are many, many metaphors throughout the discourse on the method on building, where he needs to destroy the old house completely in order to make way for the new. This is not a renovation of philosophy. This is a destruction of all previous philosophy, to revolutionize it, to set it on a new path, to provide the foundation for what we call the Copernican revolution, or the scientific revolution in the 17th century. Descartes is the philosopher that wants to, again, give us the principles for this and to be certain in terms of the new foundational position as we move forward in terms of the scientific truth, scientific reasoning through scientific reasoning and philosophy guiding the way. So in this destruction of the house, he builds a kind of provisional morality for the Reconstruction, that we must obey the laws and customs of the country and the religion. So in a way, he's very conformist and obviously covering his bets with the state and with the church during that period. Secondly, he talks about choosing firm and resolute in what one goes ahead and does. This is very important as well, to be as firm and resolute as one can be. And then thirdly, and this has brought up a lot of criticism or interest in terms of the history of philosophy, one should change one's fortune, right? I mean, change oneself instead of one's fortune. So anyway, the old adage of either you change the self or change life, change your mode of life, or change your fortune, the external, internal movement that goes on here. He is advocating for changing of the self. One must have a new emergence, new relationship to the world during this period. And then fourth and finally, the choice of one's vocation, and he has an argument for why one should be a philosopher. So this is, again, very important that that's the highest calling, at least for Rene Descartes during this period. Okay, so this is the third part, very important because it's leading the way towards the fourth part, which is crucial for our purposes, because the fourth part is concerned primarily with the birth of the cogito, the cogito, the I think, and the cogitating processes that we go through. In fact, Descartes, through the doubt and many of these methodological steps, gets to the extreme part of that only he, as a thinking thing, and this becomes universal, is able to, and this is a very violent act, only he, as a thinking thing, is certain. Who has these thoughts? Who has these ideas? What is going on? Only reality. Only thing that is certain is the thinking self. And we will go over this. Section 4 is very important. So the first four parts are really leading up, or the first three parts are leading up to the birth of the modern cogito, which is basically an institution of Western philosophy. We still speak in the verb, I think that, and of course the proposition that Descartes comes to is cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I exist. Or I am, because I think, I am a thinking being. That's what I am in terms of the ontology as a being in the world. I am a thinking being. This is what differentiates me from the animal world, and also gives me the clarity of certainty and knowing that something is real and cannot be doubted out of existence. So this is one way he's going to critique the skeptics and then put Western philosophy on a different path, that path of thinking through the cogito and the cogitations that we include. This is a very important text, I mean, for many, many reasons. Much of scientific reasoning and deductive systems come out of this. It's a very long method. Remember, he spends almost 11 years working on this slowly but surely. And of course, we could do an entire seminar just on the method in Descartes. I mean, method actually means, and we've spoken to this earlier, we've done the Socratic method. We've looked at somewhat of the method of Althusser and the method of the movement from the abstract to the concrete, which is a more dialectical method. This deductive method of Descartes based on methodological and hyperbolic doubt. So, and of course, Machiavelli's method is to mix the practical always with the theoretical and the historical, which is a very nice mix that you begin to see a kind of different tension. So again, this is a crucial document, if you will, in the history of Western philosophy for the 17th century. It still is investigated, because what Descartes does is he discovers the I that thinks, the ego, the egological region of which we speak so easily and we become so accustomed to using in our everyday speech and in our everyday thought patterns. We are always saying we're thinking about something, etc., but we don't really know what that means. To the history of the mind or the history of thinking, systems of thinking. So we'll try to explicate that greater in the classes as we move forward towards the end of the semester. And of course, hopefully all of you will pick up on this a little bit and do further investigations, both into yourself and into the world. Again, he's also talking about, the discovery of the world as well. The I that discovers the world, and that kind of separation that he makes between the I that thinks and the body that exists, right? This is another thing that we begin to see in Descartes, this mind-body dualism, and we'll speak to this later in the semester, how this situation develops and what role it has for today's world. We have a world of a big pharma and the medical practice that is very much dominated by the allopathic, which is a Cartesian model of the split between the mind and the body. Very little holistic, even though there are some part of the culture looks at the body and the human being more holistically. We're still separated from the mind from the body, or if you will, or the soul and the body, and which is an affectation that Descartes did. He severed us into two, in a sense, to make this model for the building of the new modern era on consciousness, and of course, the model of what he calls at the bottom, universalis mathesis, universal learning, or the mathematical ground of the new scientific project. So we'll speak about that more as we go forward. Anyway, I hope you enjoy. This is a beautifully written text. It's beautifully crafted, in my opinion, and something worthy of great study and restudy, and to situate it again in the struggles of the 17th century. He again, we will not go into this too much, but he does speak about the existence of God. We'll speak to this. The existence of God is based on the idea of perfection. How could we have an idea of perfection unless there was an external agency, if you will, or external cause that produced that in us? Since we are not perfect, we have no mimetic model, we have no imitative model of being perfect. And this is one of the principal premises he works through in terms of going forward, in terms of the proof of God. He needs that guarantee, if you will, in part 4. We'll speak to that a little bit too, this idea of perfection at the bottom. But anyway, the first 4 parts, again, is a very clever introduction to Descartes. I also suggest reading Rules for the Direction of the Mind, which is very, very near this. The rules are, I think, 16, 17 rules that he developed during the writing of this, and rules 5, 6, and 7, very close to what he actually articulates in the Discourse on the Method, which is part of a trilogy, including the World and Dioptrics, for his publication, 1629 and forward. Remember, Descartes lives 1596. He's born. This Discourse on the Method is begun 1618, which means he's 22 years old, and completed in 1629 when he is about 33 years old. So there's a very, very long period of wandering and methodological rigor to come up with this quote. Remember, the Discourse on the method, not a method, but the method for rightly conducting our reason. How do we conduct reasonable steps? So we'll go over this more. Again, it's always a pleasure for me, even though I'm not Cartesian or a follower of Descartes, as you will, but always a pleasure for me to reread this text in many dimensions. And we'll speak to this more and more this week when we come to him. We're also going to be moving on to the Enlightenment, the period that begins probably middle of the 18th century with Immanuel Kant's What is Enlightenment, a journalistic piece written in 1784, very crucial to, I think, what is called secularization of thought and what it means to be an enlightened human being. So this theme of education will continue from the Cartesian moment of the critique of the Descartes' critique of the curriculum to the Kantian notion of what does it mean to be an enlightened person. So that's where we'll be for the next, week, or next 3 sessions before going on to Karl Marx and the manifesto of the Communist Party. So thank you, and we will pick up more with Descartes in the classroom. Again, I want to emphasize 2 things about the writing of this. This was written in the vernacular, in French, not in Latin, which was the scholastic language. The Latin was scholastic language of the period of the early 17th century. And also, it was intended for a very broad audience because of that. And secondly of all, it was a very long journey to come to this in its completed form, these 6 parts, of which we're only reading 4, but please, by all means, read all 6 if you have the time and the courage to engage. Okay, thank you and see you soon. Bye-bye.